I want to welcome you to the first session of Parapsychology Foundation Presents. This is the first speaker session. We had our opening session a few minutes ago. And we're running from now and through 5:30 Eastern, so it'll be all day. And as you can see, there's a list of all of the speakers. I'm going to read into the record Etzel's biography, but first I just did this slide so that you can see his co-editors, John Palmer from the Rhine Research Center and David Marcusson-Clavertz, who is with you, isn't he, Etzel?
Yeah, he's about to finish his PhD.
Ah, wonderful. Well, congratulations to him. And then this book this year was one of two on our list today that received the Parapsychological Association Book Award for 2015. So that's what this, let me get my pointer, that's what this seal is all about. So now I'm just going to read this set of information that we have put together about Etzel, and you'll notice we have a very nice ghost photo of Etzel, which he thought we should use. So Dr. Etzel Cardeña, the chief editor of Parapsychology, a handbook for the 21st century, holds the endowed Thorson Chair in Psychology with a remit in Parapsychology and Hypnosis at Lund University in Sweden. He has graduate degrees from York University and the University of California, Davis, and was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University, a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Association for Psychological Science. He's been the president of Division 30 of the APA, the Society for Clinical and Experimental Psychology, as well as president of the Parapsychological Association, and his work has received awards from these and other organizations over his career. Professor Cardeña has more than 300 publications in more than 10 languages, including the 2 editions of Varieties of Anomalous Experience, Altering Consciousness, which is a 2-volume book, and the ebook Non-Ordinary Mental Expressions for Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. That's the series. He has also worked professionally in theater and is the artistic director of the International Theater of Malmö in Sweden. Parapsychology, his latest anthology, edited with Dr. John Palmer and David Marcusson-Clavertz, was awarded, as I said before, the Parapsychological Association Book Award in 2015. So Etzel, I'm keying up your PowerPoint, and I'm going to get out of the way, and it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks for the invitation, Nancy, Carlos, Lisette. And I have just a few minutes to talk about, and I really cannot do justice to any of the chapters, but to give a general introduction to this book and say what it is about so that you can look more carefully at it if you are interested. So I'm moving to the next slide, and there is no coincidence that there's an older book called the Handbook of Parapsychology, and that our book, as the subtitle, has a handbook. And the reason for this is that handbook, at least in psychology, has 2 basic meanings. Or actually in psychology it has 1 main meaning, and it is an overview of the field. So in psychology, you may be able to find a handbook, let's say, of attachment research, and that gives you an overview of all of the important aspects of what is being done in that area. So that is one aspect of our book. The other aspect, and it refers to another sense of the word handbook, is that if you look at more technical aspects, a handbook is something that gives you the know-how to do things. So what we were trying to do was to have both things, to give either a novice or even a more experienced researcher in parapsychology the tools, the know-how to know what kind of research design should be contemplated, what are the pitfalls, what to look for, what kind of statistical issues one has to be aware of. And so that was one big aspect. But the other big aspect was to give an overview of, in our perspective, how the field looks now in 2015. So we have a number of chapters from a number of world-class experts, including Carlos and Nancy, who are here, and a number of other ones. So, one thing that I can tell you comparing the earlier handbook to this one is that, for instance, in contrast to what a critic like Ray Hyman might say, that parapsychology is dead, and he wrote a paper like that saying parapsychology is dead because it doesn't change, it is always the same, it doesn't have any progress, that there have been a number of changes from the previous edition or from the previous handbook to this one. And among them is that, for instance, there is right now in this book we have a whole chapter on experimental effects, and that is the idea that it has been described a number of times that in the field, typically most people end up getting very small effects, if at all, when they do very careful research, and then there are some people who get spectacularly stronger, bigger effects. That is, that they end up finding much clearer evidence. And one of the things proposed about this is that the experimenter has to do with this. And there are two main aspects to how the experimenter may be able to affect what happens. One is what we might call the psychological experimenter effects. That is, if you are more social, if you treat your participants better, if you are enthusiastic about what you're doing, if you want things to happen, you're far more likely to get results than if you are a cold, disagreeable, unpleasant researcher. And so that is one aspect, let's say the psychological experimenter effect. But also people have been talking about what is called the parapsychological experimenter effects. And that is the theory that some experimenters may either tend to be very successful all or most of the time, whereas other experimenters are not successful any of the time, because themselves, in some way or another, may end up doing their parapsychological abilities to end up affecting what is going to happen. So this is a very important topic. It refers to an extent to what have been called observer theories in physics that have been adapted to try to explain what happens in parapsychology. So that is the fourth point in that slide. So that is something that is very important, being talked about, especially among the people who are trying to develop physical theories for parapsychology. That it may be that it's not only the psychological pleasant or unpleasant aspects or an effectiveness of the researcher, but maybe the researcher's own psi. The next point is what we might call implicit psi. And that is the notion that, and there is some research showing that it may be that there is far more psi effects than we tend to see, but that kind of effect happens implicitly. That is, we are not even consciously aware that we are being affected. So in this kind of research of implicit psi, what you might want to do is not to ask a person whether, for example, he or she is able to guess the image that somebody else is looking at in another building, but rather look at whether the person's choices are affected by what the person in another building's image is looking at. So that, in other words, non-conscious aspects may be more prevalent, and that it may be easier to see psi performance non-consciously than consciously. And that is something that, of course, has been very much talked about in psychology, and there is growing work on this area. So that is implicit psi. And then there is also called physical correlates of psi, to find out whether there are atmospheric, local sidereal, a number of other variables that may have to do with, for example, solar activity, that may have an influence on whether an experiment is likely to be successful or not. And the last point in that slide is distant mental influence of living systems, and that is research trying to find out whether, instead of a person trying to affect, for example, in the case of psychokinesis, something that is inert, like some dice or some computer random number generator, whether we can affect living systems such as another human being, another living being that is not human, cell cultives, and things of that sort. So there are a number of areas that are new really to research in our handbook that were not really contemplated in the previous handbook. So with that as a general overview, let me go to, okay, there it is, to the next one. And what I'm going to do, because we have many different chapters, is to just mention one or two things about each of the chapters. Then after some minutes, I know that we will have time if you have some specific question, but I cannot go into detail in any of them because I would take all of the time that we have. So if you go to the slide that we are looking at now, there's a preface by the editors. And as I have mentioned, we make the case that parapsychology research is not dead, that it continues to have developments. It has statistical developments, research developments, theoretical developments, and we then provide some definitions of what we mean by parapsychology and what we do not mean by parapsychology. And that is especially important because I think if you look at more the general literature, all kinds of things are called parapsychology or parapsychology research or parapsychologists that are not what the people that, for example, are members of the Parapsychological Association would call parapsychology. And then we talk about what we consider unfair criticism, things that we know are not true, that are demonstrably false, but that nonetheless a number of critics keep on repeating again and again. For example, that there is no scientific research on parapsychology, that the scientific method is not used with it, that there is no evidence supportive of psi phenomena, and so on. So that's the preface. On chapter 1, we have nonetheless Nancy Grone, Carlos Alvarado, and Garrett Hövelman. So US, Puerto Rico, and Germany joining forces and talk about what have been the modern developments since the previous edition or since the previous handbook book. And a number of items are, for example, research with unselected participants, looking at whether a person may be able to affect just by mental minds, just by the mind, some kind of system like a random number generator, near-death experiences, and so on. There are many other aspects. One of them very important are meta-analysis, which is a statistical technique in which you end up conflating, taking a number of different studies and seeing whether there's a pattern either that there is evidence for a theory or no evidence for a theory. And the meta-analysis are particularly important in some areas in medicine and psychology when what we're talking about are very small effects. And I don't think any researcher in parapsychology would argue with me that by and large, the effects that we get typically in parapsychology research in the laboratory are very small. So the only way that you will be able to make a case for or against is to look at whether there is a pattern of many studies. One other thing is that I think in particular in the last few years we have seen a number of articles on parapsychology research published in a number of mainstream journals. So that I think is a positive aspect. When we go to chapter 2 by Ed Kelly, who I know will be talking to you, I think the main idea, and this is I think a very important idea, is that Ed Kelly and a number of his collaborators have been making a case that one could talk about a lot of evidence that not only comes from parapsychology, but also just from ordinary psychological events that do not seem to be easily explained by the traditional reductionist materialist position that would state that basically we have to, at the basis, find only molecules, atoms, their interactions, and that there is no causal effect of mind in the world. And Ed and company make a case that even leaving aside parapsychology, that is not a theory that seems to even be able to produce good explanations even for something like memory. And I think increasingly we have had a number of eminent people in the science, neuroscientists and philosophers, people like Giulio Tononi, and in the case of philosophy, Thomas Nagel, that have been writing more and more that consciousness, mind, does not seem to be something that can be explained by what we know about features from matter. So I think that is a very important idea that needs to be taken more into consideration when thinking about parapsychology and psychology in general. So following on, we get to chapter 3. And there we had a contributor whose position is that there is no evidence, no good research evidence for parapsychology. He does think that in naturally occurring phenomena, such as a person, for example, dreaming about an event in very discrete, particular ways, and that event coming true, that may be true, but that the evidence that comes from parapsychology research from the laboratory can be explained by two main aspects. Fraud, that is, that there are some people, he does not mention anybody in the last few decades that has been fraudulent in the field, but nonetheless he says, well, theoretically, at least we know that fraud happens in all of sciences. Fraud may be happening in our science, so that some of the effect that we have gotten from meta-analysis could be explained away by fraudulent researchers, and also by what is called the file drawer effect, which means just that a person may end up doing an experiment, not finding any supportive evidence for parapsychology, and just not publish that study. Okay? Now, I don't have too much time to comment, but I have to say in the final episode, I give my reasons why I think Stokes' case is unpersuasive, at least to me and I think to other people in the field. Chapter 4 is by John Palmer, and it is a very useful how-to on how to conduct experiments on what is called anomalous cognition, or what people may call telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, and anomalous perturbation, that is PK phenomena. So if you are interested in conducting research and you haven't been doing this for a long time, I very much recommend that you take a look at John's chapter. But we are not, as we go into the next slide, we are not only giving a how-to to the people who want to conduct research in the lab, but also to people who do research on spontaneous cases. And that is the chapter 5 by Emily Kelly and Jim Tucker. And one of the important things that they do is to have a positive definition of psi. It's not a new definition. If you go back to Mrs. Sidgwick at the beginning of the 20th century, for example, you will find that she and other people of the Society for Psychical Research were basically stating that there was evidence that consciousness did have a causal effect on the world, a direct causal effect. And that is the positive definition that they have for psi, and they also have a how-to on how to conduct systematic, well-done research on cases, for example, of people who claim that they were somebody else in a previous life. And of course that brings about its number of difficulties on how to do it well. So that is what that chapter is all about. The following chapter by Watkins is if you want to work on not spontaneous cases that have to do with a person who may be talking about something that he or she dreamt about, or a memory of a possible past life, but a person who might tell you, I can affect physical objects in such a clear, strong way that you can see what I'm doing. Or in other words, what you may be talking about is where the people may bend keys, may make the molecular structure of objects change so much that they may end up levitating, moving, doing all kinds of things like that. And that is a chapter of what kinds of things one needs to do for people who make these claims. And of course, this is something that is important and also very difficult, because as we know, a lot of fraud was committed during the history of parapsychology by people who claimed that they could levitate and do many things. And a number of them, not all, but a number of them were found to do tricks. So one essentially needs to know what to be on the guard for. But I would say also strongly recommended to become or to co-work with somebody who's a magician, an illusionist, who may know how this works. So that's episode 6, and I'll take a seat while you also take a breath. On chapter 7, it's statistical guidelines, including more recent developments such as Bayesian statistics. It's very useful again for somebody who wants to conduct research. The following chapter, the 8th chapter by Rex Stanford, makes the case against what I call the implicit psi. That is the notion by him and also by Jim Carpenter that probably it is not that psi phenomena occur every so often, but rather that they are occurring all the time and that they are affecting our cognition, but that most of the time we are just not consciously aware of them. So in these views, psi phenomena are not just something extraordinary and unusual that every so often happens, but rather they are just a flow of information that is constantly changing and affecting your choices, your deliberations, your daydreams, and so on. That's chapter 8. Chapter 9 with David and me, what we do is to review the literature on whether there is a relation between altered states of consciousness or consciousness alterations, dispositions, and beliefs, whether a person may believe, does it make a difference whether a person believes in parapsychology or not on his or her performance in a research project. And essentially the bottom line is that there is supportive evidence that yes, at least some alterations of consciousness that mostly have to do with feeling that you are no longer in a normal state, that maybe you feel more unbounded, seem to have a relation to doing better in parapsychology research, and that believing that you may be able to do well in a study is a benefit. Is not as strong, but it is somewhat of a predictor that you may be able to do. And conversely, if you think that all of this is nonsense, is like, what is the name for it? A self-prophecy insofar as people who believe that they won't do well tend not to do well. Which of course may help explain why there is this discrepancy between the very strong critics and the people who are supportive of this field, insofar as the critics who believe there is nothing to it may be very unlikely to at least be conscious of things that might occur to them. So that's chapter 9. Chapter 10, Meditation and Psi by Serena Roney-Dougal, does a review of the literature. Serena has done a number of important studies about it, and the bottom line is that yes, there seems to be a link between doing meditation and Psi, especially with very, very long-term meditators. So in one of her studies, she found that people who had been meditating for decades not only seemed to do very well and strongly well, but also seemed to be aware when they could be certain of their answer and when they were not certain that they would succeed. So that is certainly an area that requires a lot more research, but there is something to it. That is the good news. The bad news is that it seems to mostly require people who have been meditating for a long, long time to find an effect. In chapter 11, Richard Broughton makes a case that psi phenomena, as many other psychological aspects, should be framed within evolutionary terms, and that one should think that there may be some kind of profitable aspect to have psi. The following chapter by David Luke is on drugs and psi, and even though a lot of this work has not been systematic, whatever there is, plus a number of anecdotal cases, do seem to show that some drugs, especially psychedelic drugs, seem to have an enhancing effect on psi. In other words, that at least some people, when they are tripping on some psychedelic, may be able, or at least they seem to be able to obtain information or become conscious of that information that they would not ordinarily do in their non-drug state. So that is chapter 12. We are now moving into 13, which is an explanation of physics theories for psi, and it mostly talks about observational theories and decision augmentation theory. This is complicated, but essentially the notion in one sentence is that, for example, an experimenter who may want a certain outcome may not be able to affect every single note, but may be able, through his or her eventual observation, to slightly slant the effect of the study. So this is an area that is very interesting to read about, and this chapter, at least for me, is the clearest statement I have read. The following by Adrian Ryan, is about the evidence and research on whether such physical correlates as geomagnetic fields seem to have an effect on psi, and what kind of psi, whether it is PK or telepathy or precognition. And the bottom line is that yes, there is evidence that at least suggests that there is some effect. For the next one, 15, there is a tour de force chapter by 3 collaborators, and they do a very thorough statistical analysis for 4 areas that have been developed a lot in the parapsychology research. What is called Ganzfeld, which is when you essentially are in a sensory uniform context in which you only are exposed to what looks like red fields and are listening to just white noise and are not moving. That in Ganzfeld research, or in forced choice, when you are asked to guess, for example, between 2 choices, is this a plus or a minus that I have in a car that you are unable to see? Of course, this will be done better than I am exemplifying it now, but where you have to give one specific choice, all in remote viewing, and that is something that Ed May, I'm sure, will be talking a lot more about, and Green Psi research, that when looking at all of the published research on that, there is statistical evidence for all 4 areas. Some of them have stronger support than others, and there are also some caveats. For example, in the case of Ganzfeld, and this is, I think, something very important that to me becomes very clear when going through all of these chapters, the notion is that there seems to be a clear case that it is not as if psi seems to be distributed democratically, at least as far as performing well in a laboratory setting. Rather, it seems that there are some people who do clearly much better than the rest of us, and that the majority of us tend not to do that well. That most of us, at least in the lab setting, and think that in a lab setting there is nothing that is really important for a person, that in a lab setting there is nothing that is emotionally charged. And at least in those circumstances, most of us do not seem to do particularly well, and just a minority of people seem to do well. Maybe the meditators that I talked about, maybe there are other people who are just sensitive, or artists who seem to do better, and so on and so forth. I'm trying now to use the pointer. I don't know if it's working, bringing it to number 16. But in any case, I'm in chapter 16, implicit anomalous cognition, and this is, thank you, this is, it's not working for, okay, hold on a second. Yes, and now it is. That is what I was talking about, the notion that there is research showing that psi information may affect us in ways that we may not be conscious of, but we may nonetheless be able to evaluate. Which takes us to the next chapter, chapter 17, which reviews the literature on psi and psychophysiology, and 16 and 17, they go together hand in hand, and 18 very easily, because they all of these chapters seem to show that there seems to be an effect, and that perhaps psi should be studied not so much as what the person is consciously aware of, but how a distant influence may affect the person's attention, even without his or her being consciously aware of, whether the person has a sense of whether he or she is being watched, and things of that sort. Which brings us to here, chapter 18, distant intention phenomena, and that just follows from the previous chapters, and it has the notion that somebody else who may be in another, for example, in another building, may help you to meditate better, even without you realizing when he or she is trying to do it, that when that person at randomly chosen times is trying to make you focus better, that may be able to help you. And there is also some research, controlled research, that when a person may be watching you through an audiovisual system, that you may be affected, and perhaps more through your psychophysiology than your conscious awareness of it. So 16, 17, and 18, in a sense, go together very well. Chapter 19 talks now, if we move from, let's call it information, or let's call it mental events of what you are aware of, moves more to research on macropsychokinesis, whether there may be a direct effect between a person's intention to change a system such as a random number generator, in which the influence may be very, very minute, or whether there may be something much larger, like making a table levitate. And Stephen Brody, a philosopher who has been working on this for a long, long time, makes the case that there is as good research for and evidence for what is called micro, that is affecting very minute systems, or macro psychokinesis, and that perhaps they should be talked about in tandem. Which brings us to the next chapter, okay, Macropsychokinesis by Mario Varbolis and Peter Van Zel. And the bottom line, I think the most important for those of you who know this literature, is that it makes the case that even though there was a while ago a study that was conducted by, I think it was three different research centers, that apparently in that study there was no support for the main hypothesis that a person could show an effect on random number generators, on, again, micro effects on a system. But what Mario Varbolis and Peter Van Zel do is to do a reanalysis and show that actually there is support if we consider that most of the evidence that had been obtained previously in the Princeton laboratory had been obtained, the supportive evidence had been obtained by a few people who performed much better than others. So again, we come to this repeated theme that comes back again, and that is that selected participants seem indeed to do much better than the majority of us. So that this may be a case that we need to really select participants much better. Just take a breather, because we are past the half of the topic, and I think we don't have as much. So continuing with the notion of both implicit psi and psychokinesis, we have Roger Nelson talking about and writing about his project, which is called Global Consciousness. And the idea here is that when something very important happens, that this event is somehow affects the consciousness of many people in the globe, and that this has an effect as well in random number generators that are distributed throughout the globe. One needs to really look carefully and read carefully how all of this works together, but the bottom line again here is that there is supportive evidence that this does happen, that in some major events such as 9/11 and so on, that the random number generators that typically are just producing events randomly seem to have a deviation from randomness. So the idea behind this is that maybe in some way we are connecting, there is something that affects most people in the globe. I have already talked about experimental effects, and John Palmer and Brian Miller have a whole chapter on it, 22nd. Chapter 23 on mental mediumship, something that has returned to parapsychology in the last few years. We have Julie Weichel and Nan doing a review of the literature on this. There has been increased research. There is supportive research. Not all of the studies have found evidence that mediums come with precise information that cannot be accounted just by typical ordinary explanations, but there are some studies that have found that with good control, especially Julie Weichel and Emily Kelly. So there is that work, and other people have been looking at other areas. For example, whether mediums going to see a medium when after you have lost somebody important may make you feel better, independently of whether that medium gives you some information that could not be obtained through ordinary means. And speaking of death, we get to chapter 24, reincarnation. by Tonya Mills and Jim Tucker, and they continue, they and other people have continued the work that Ian Stevenson started a number of decades ago, and there continue to be a greater sophistication on how this research is done, and there continues to be some cases that I would say are difficult to explain away as just being random events or children coming up with information that any child could be able to fantasize. By the way, since I am a hypnosis person, let me just mention that overall we do not have evidence that past life hypnosis brings about any information that could be thought of as evidential for previous lives, with maybe a couple of exceptions. But by and large, that is not what this chapter is about. It is about much more children coming up with spontaneous information about this. The next chapter by Misha Maher is about ghosts and poltergeists, review of the research. There hasn't really been that much, except perhaps Walter von Lukatow in Germany devised his own theory and has tried to explain what happens in poltergeists and the development of a poltergeist case according to his theory, which is based in quantum mechanics. Getting to the final few chapters, Leary and Boulder review electronic voice phenomena, the notion that some people may be able, dead people may communicate to you through recordings or telephones or whatever. And here I would say that they are clear that there is not strong supportive research, that there is really need for much more systematic research that has been the case so far. So that is, at that point, we are essentially, let me talk about also Rupert Sheldrake. The next chapter, Science Every Day, gives a review of Rupert's, I think, fairly creative number of studies showing in what way the things that in everyday life we tend to think are indicative of psi, such as some cats, like maybe Pinky in the future, or some of the cats I have had seem to be aware of when the person, the owner, or maybe we should call it the ownee to be more honest, whether they are somehow able to sense when a person is starting to come home even after the person is very far away, or whether the notion that people have a sense that somebody is looking at them and they turn around and there is indeed somebody looking at them, that these kind of everyday phenomena that are not as verified as what ends up happening in most psi research, Rupert Sheldrake has come with different and creative ways of testing them, and there is good evidence, I would say, or there is supportive evidence of his work. So, overall, what do we have? Some areas have stronger support than others, but a number of areas I think are consistent in showing that there seems to be supportive research for psi phenomena, that this comes more from selected participants, and that overall the effect has not vanished even when people have started doing more controls in experimental work, even though the effects are rather small, as I think we should expect when in laboratory settings we're not talking about life and death events. From Germany, we have the chapter by Bales and Fach in which they talk about what kind of exceptional experiences, including possible ostensible psi phenomena of people experiencing that somebody's thinking their thoughts or that they know what they are thinking about, that all of those events may end up making a person feel disturbed, and so that the clinician should know about them. Thanks for the extension, Nancy. I am getting to the last few. And the last three chapters, the one is called Apply Psi, by especially people who have been working remote viewing, and they talk about apply remote viewing, how that has been worked, or how that has worked in studies in which it has been tried, in which it has been applied to try to predict how the future of metals, of what is going to happen in actual events in real life. And the next to last chapter by Garrett Hövelman, he talks about that independently even of the validity or not of the psi phenomena, that parapsychology has contributed mightily to science in a number of different ways by developing or using more sophisticated statistical analysis, by being pioneers and exemplifying good research methods and many other aspects. So even though in the history of psychology, this has been, in a sense, a cover-up of what has occurred, a lot of what is now mainstream started in the hands of parapsychology research. And finally, I just give my very personal views on, after having worked on all of these chapters, going back and forth on the patterns in the literature, and give my suggestion for future research. And essentially, what I do is that even though I do not agree with the criticism that there is no there, the Doc Stoke says there is no evidence. I think there is evidence. I think it is consistent evidence coming from a number of different research areas. And even if you do statistical analysis to try to account for criticism, it is still there. So I think there is definitely something there when you look at naturally occurring events of people coming suddenly with a dream, which has happened to me, which probably has happened to a number of people who are listening to this, that you say, this cannot just be coincidence. Typically, events that have a lot to do with strong emotions, somebody very close to you, that this is happening, it gives us a sense that there is much greater interconnectedness, and this is not just a whimsical idea, because when you look at theories from quantum physics, you find the notion that at the quantum level there is interconnectedness throughout the universe. Having said that, I think we're still very, very far away from understanding what this is all about. That anybody, I think, who claims, oh, I know how parapsychological phenomena work, I know what it is, well, I would hire him or her immediately. Because I think what we know, people who do research in this area, is that we engage in doing a study, and we're not certain whether we will get good results or not, which is different from some areas that, for instance, I do research with, which I think indicates that even though we know something, and we know more than when that older handbook started, we're very far away from having a good grasp, and that probably if we ever get a good grasp of this, it will be very different than what we have in this book. I don't think it is coming anytime soon, so you can still read it, I think, without a problem. So I quoted the British poet John Keats, who in a letter to his brother in 1817 coined a term called negative capability. And he says, this is an ability, and that is when a human is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts. And I think if you're interested in such phenomena, you need to have negative capability. Otherwise, you will become completely persuaded that you know how it all works, which I don't buy for a second, nor you will have a sense that all of this is nonsense and you can throw it away, which again is something that I don't believe is true either. So to finish this with a quotation of one of my other favorite writers, Anton Chekhov, I'm saying that the limitations of knowledge are based on a number of different phenomena, and that these limitations are real, and that we need to understand them, to accept them, and not to follow those, and this is the quotation by Anton Chekhov, those fools and charlatans who know and understand everything. So even though we came up with a big fat book, this book does not pretend to know and understand everything. And I would tell you, if you know of someone who tells you, yes, I know and understand how all of this works, go and look somebody else. So that is it. Ready for any questions? Nan, you tell me how much time we have, because I went above my time, and I can be here and entertain questions or comments.
We've got about 9 minutes, because I extended the time to 10:55, and these are some of the questions that Lizette, Carlos, and I had. Carlos has put one of them into the chat, which is, how has been the reception so far of the book?
Well, I think I need to wait more. Obviously, it was good that the PA gave it an award. I know there are book reviews coming, but there is only one book review that I saw, and it was psychologist. And he did not like it, but he was saying, well, why do parapsychologists whine so much about being mistreated? But I got a sense that I think he had an agenda of his own that he was talking about. But I know that there are reviews that will be coming in the Society for Psychical Research and other areas, and psych-critiques, which should be important. So it's still I think too early to know. I know that Bial Foundation, they bought 15 copies to give it to all of the board. Yes, that, what is his name? Our good friend in Portugal, the president.
Maria de Sousa.
No, the guy.
Oh, Luis Portela.
That Luis bought a number of issues and gave it to the whole board, in a sense, because we know that in the board there are some people who are more critical than others, and it was to give a sense of there is good, solid work done here. Luis Portela, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Margaret was asking, are you aware of theories that bring in the idea of a hologramic universe, and does that have any bearing on? Is that useful for parapsychology?
Well, I would not say hologramic, because of course then you have the notion that came really to an extent from Karl Privram and other people and Talbot who got that idea, and I don't think that in the last few years has been written about very much. What has been written about very much, though, is the notion, for example, D'Espagnat, a very important theoretician in physics, has written about that, has written that there is an interconnectedness for everything, and that the notion that there are separate objects or separate beings is somehow wrong. That even though that is what we perceive in ordinary ways, that is not what happens. So D'Espagnat, at least in his book Philosophy and Physics, does not refer to parapsychological phenomena, but of course there are a number of other current physicists who do, Henry Stapp and others. So I think the hologramic, and even Karl Privram would say that is more of a metaphor, is not something that is very much talked about, but the notion of an interconnectedness at least the quantum level is something that is far more accepted. The notion is whether people, physicists, want to also say, well, this could be a ground for how psi phenomena might work. I know here there is a question, NDEs and OBs were not covered. Was it an editorial decision? Should we expect a chapter about this phenomena? Quickly, it was not an editorial decision. It wasn't insofar as we had asked someone who is an expert on NDEs, and typically NDEs will end up also covering OBEs. But we had somebody who's an expert who then could not write a chapter, and by that time we did not think that there was enough time, and because in another book that I co-edited the previous year, Varieties of Anomalous Experience, we had a chapter on NDEs and OBEs. The NDEs by Bruce Grayson, probably the world's foremost authority on the topic, and the OBEs by somebody who goes by the name of Carlos Alvarado, by myself, that we have had those chapters in it, and so we did not think that it was worth to delay the publication of the book trying to find someone who could then take it. But I know, and I know that Carlos would have also liked to have a chapter on that. And I don't know if there will be a second edition. Buy the book, that will make it more likely. Recommend it, but if there is, probably we would have it. Nonetheless, having said that, you should know that in the chapter by Nan and Carlos and Garrett, they do talk about near-death experiences. They do have references to them. So it is not as if it is completely ignored. It wasn't completely ignored. There was just not a specific chapter for it.
If any of the questions on our slide are something that you'd like to ask, you covered the content extremely well, feel free. And if anybody else has a question, get it in there quick. We've got 3 minutes before I have to shut the course and let us take a break. Oh, here's Michael Dugan has one. Do you see this, Etzel?
What is the strongest and experimental psychology? Don't quite see it. By the way, highly said, I know that you're somewhere around there. What area of
It says,
psychology will enter
there
the
you go.
mainstream first? Okay, there are about 2 or 3 different questions. Well, thanks for the pauses. But I think the strongest areas, probably, despite what not as many people doing work on that as we could. I think Ganzfeld research is overall something that seems to be solidly there. I have worked on it. It's somewhat frustrating because, for example, I have found out, or in a study that we're starting to write, one realizes that you cannot do Ganzfeld on the cheap, that you should have every person be in the Ganzfeld for 30 minutes, that is really induce an altered state, and otherwise it does not seem to work, something that Chuck Honerton had written about, but I had not read it, unfortunately, before we did what we did. So I think that is solid. I think also the general notion of getting implicit, non-conscious measures of effect is very important. And there we have to figure out much more how to do that. There have been ideas from Rex Stanford and Jim Carpenter, but I think we need to figure out a lot more on how we can measure side effects that are not based on a person's conscious awareness of what is happening to him or her. As far as the Lund chair, I think it is going fine. I'm happy. We continue working on this. We work on other areas. We continue being attacked by the other folks in Sweden, but what is new? So I'm happy.
Well, we've reached 10:53, so I think we're probably going to have to close it off. I just wanted to mention to everybody that both of the PowerPoints are downloadable from the course schedule, and all the links will be live when you download it. You can also ask Etzel more questions in the discussion area of the course feed, and he'll be around on and off, and there will be a recording available probably over the next couple of days. I'll keep an eye on that. So thank you, Etzel. This was an excellent talk, very informative and a wonderful commercial.
Can you put my, if you can see, here is the,
yes, of course.
this is Rito.
Who is
reading
it?
Pinky and Sibling.
They look like sisters. That's wonderful.
That's him. Okay, thank you.
Him. Well, brothers, we'll see you all at 11 a.m. David Jahar will be speaking on The Witch of Lime Street, Seance, Seduction, and Houdini in the Spirit World. A very interesting historical book about the 1920s in psychical research and parapsychology. So I'm going to close the course off, and thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you in a couple of minutes.
Thanks. Bye-bye.